So in Screencast 1 this week, we considered more information on the size of the sports market and economy, and the size of the sport economy in different EU member states, and we looked at how the structure of those economies could kind of provide reasons why there was a difference in size and the different characteristics of different sport economies. But what we haven't yet done is kind of provided you with some models for understanding how the sport market all hangs together. So in this screencast, I want to introduce you to a simple model for understanding the sports market in terms of the role of the different suppliers in the industry, and how suppliers and consumers interact, and how this generates flows of money into and around the sports economy. So I'm going to look at a couple of models, the first one in Screencast 2 and the next one in Screencast 3. Okay, so the first thing to say about the sports market is to think about elite sport. So those of you who have looked at sports development at all in the past will know that there is a kind of sport development continuum which takes us through from participation at the bottom, which is kind of, normal people taking part in sport, or, average participants taking part in sport, through to the kind of the superhumans, as I called them last week, the elite athletes at the top of the pyramid, competing in national and international competitions. Now, in many countries, at the top level, sport flows in from commercial sponsorship, paying spectators, so people paying to see the expertise, the skill, the prowess of these athletes, and from television companies in exchange for broadcasting rights, and government funding and lottery funding in certain countries, but by no means all. So, for example, and we'll talk about this in later lectures, in the UK, the government puts in a substantial amount of money through the national lottery, which it legislated for and licenses, and some of the money from the national lottery is put into sport, and some of the money for sport is put into supporting elite athletes, allowing them to train, allowing them to kind of support their training, their lifestyle, so that they can concentrate just on performing as well as they can. So in the UK that happens, whereas in the US, for example, there is no federal government money goes into elite sports and Olympic sports. It is all done through kind of sponsorship and commercial funding. So there are different models in different countries. Although it's primarily commercial, it's also subsidised by the government in a lot of countries. The US is relatively unusual. And economics as an area of study can be used to help provide a rationale for and to assess the cost effectiveness of such government intervention and subsidy. So Simon Shively, who's professor and head of the Sport Industry Research Centre, he's done research on the cost of each gold medal or each medal that the Great Britain Olympics team has won in the last several Olympic Games. Okay, so we've got elite sport on one level of this model, and the other part of the model we've got mass participation. Right? And in the mass participation sector, money flows in to the market from the government, mostly local government, in the form of subsidies. So there are subsidies in this sector because although participants pay, they don't pay a kind of price enough to cover, in many sports, the costs of their participation. So the government subsidises. It provides a subsidy to meet the additional costs of their participation, which are not being met by the admission charges that they pay to these sports facilities. Okay. And in the mass participation end of the market as well, the voluntary sector also makes a very significant contribution, both in terms of opportunities to participate, but this is not really a direct financial contribution. It's in terms of volunteers' time, which is difficult to put an economic value on, but when we look at models in the next screencast, we will try and look at the importance of the voluntary sector and try and put an economic value on that. And also, as we've seen, mass participation being the engine room of large areas of the sport industry, expenditure on items such as sports clothing, sports shoes, equipment and travel, which is largely spent in the mass participation end of the market, that flows to the commercial sector. And the commercial sector and these expenditures through VAT, value-added tax, or sales tax as it might be called in other countries, and income tax on people working in the sport industry, and corporation tax on sport businesses also generates income which flows to the government, which leads us on to this next slide. And I did mention this in the lecture last week. The fact that in England, the government is a kind of net beneficiary of the sport industry. So, total government income from taxation on sport-related activity, that is corporation tax on businesses in sport, that is VAT on sales of sports goods and sports activity, generates £11.2 billion of tax receipts for the government in England. In England, the government spends through subsidies to elite performers, to local government, to facilities and other forms of grants. It spends around £3.5 billion. So the government has a £7.7 billion surplus from the sport industry in the UK. Or to put it another way, it invests £1 in sport for every £3.20 in taxes it receives on sport-related activity. So sport is a net contributor to the UK government. And you'll hear this kind of argument mentioned lots of times in terms of sport, saying you should invest back into us. But across many countries, the UK is not unique in this. Across many countries, sport contributes more to government budgets and coffers than it receives back from the government. And this picture has been going on for some time. So these figures on this slide are taken from the CIRC report on the economic value of sport in England, for Sport England in 2017-2018. I did mention last week that the Sport and Recreation Alliance, using figures from 2008, had made a similar argument. And what we can see here is, if we go back to 2005, that government receipts from tax, and this is in the UK, not England, had increased from 6.4 billion to 7.1 billion between 2005 and 2008. And in England, we can see that income, just in England, not the UK, by the way, income has increased to 11.2 billion. Okay. At the same time, we can see that in the period 2005 to 2008, the amount that the government had spent on sport via subsidies, grants to individuals and to organisations to support sport hadn't really increased significantly. Now, interestingly to me, in the CERC report, and I need to speak to people in CERC about this, this shows that government expenditure on sport increased £2 billion between 2008, when it was 1.4 billion, and 2017-18, when it had gone up to 3.5 billion. Now, this kind of runs counter, and this is counterintuitive to me, because in the UK, following the credit crunch and the last recession, we had a period of austerity, and austerity has meant a reduction in government spending across many areas of public life. And certainly my sector in sport, where I came from in the sport industry, was local government sport. That has seen a huge reduction in the grants that it receives from government in order to provide services. So I cannot explain that increase in government expenditure. But what I'm saying is that I will try and speak to somebody in CERC to try and see if we can account for that. But nevertheless, this still shows us that government is a net beneficiary from the sport industry. The sport industry generates a surplus for the UK government. It's not really an area of subsidy. Okay, so if we were in a lecture now, I'd show you this slide and I'd say, well, here is a rather simplified sport development pyramid hierarchy. And down here we've got mass participation sport, and here we've got elite sport. Sport development students might kind of understand that down here we've got a kind of introduction to sport, which happens in schools through the physical education curriculum in schools, where virtually everybody is exposed to sport, and then people choose to participate in sport. So the next level up is a participation level. People who are high level participants may have their talent spotted and might move into kind of performance programs, where they then have the opportunity to progress through the levels up to elite sports. But for the purposes of this model, we've just got an elite sport end of the market and a mass participation sport end of the market. Now, if we were in a lecture, I would give you a task as a face-to-face task. And I would say, okay, well, here are some labels, and now I want you to show me where you think these labels fit, because what we can see is here there is some kind of flows of money into the sports market, the sport economy, from certain groups or sources or types of consumers. So this happens at the elite and the mass participation sport level. And also we've got flows out of the sport economy. Yeah. So what I would do usually is give you this to look at and then ask you to talk about this in groups and come back to me. But we can't really do that, and I can't afford to leave this as an exercise that we pick up in the face-to-face, because you need to understand some of this before we move on to the next part of the lecture. So I'm going to put up a slide which shows you this. So what we can see is that at the elite end of the sports market, we have sources of money, largely from the commercial sector, so sponsorship. So sponsorship of elite sport people and elite sport events. So elite sport people, we have sponsorship from sport sources such as Adidas or Nike, sponsoring their athletes, sponsoring some competitions, and we also have non-sport sponsorship. So an example of this might be a financial services sector organisation sponsoring a league, or an internet service provider sponsoring a league, or a competition. Yeah. We also have paying spectators and match day revenue in football. We talked about the importance of that last week, and we said that last week in the lecture that paying spectators and the absence of paying spectators in the current shutdown as a result of coronavirus and COVID-19 was a major hit to lower league football, and it was also a hit to the Premier League. So we have paying spectators. We also have TV rights. Yeah. Now, some sports have lots of TV rights, and some sports have lots of sponsorship. Others don't. But we all know about the escalation in the value of TV rights for professional football, and particularly in this country, the seemingly limitless levels that broadcasters and cable companies will bid for the right to broadcast the English Premier League. And we've also got government. So in this country, the government supports UK Sport, which is an agency which in turn supports elite level sport and is responsible for elite level sport. So the government puts some government department money in to elite sport, and also through a national lottery, it invests some of that money into elite sport. Okay, now, down at the mass participation level, the picture is less commercial. So if we look at here, this is dominated by the commercial sector, right? Commercial sources of revenue with some input from the government. Here, the commercial sector is far less significant. What we see is government subsidies, largely at the local government level, to provide facilities. Yeah, and we have paying users, consumers, paying entrance fees and memberships to use these facilities, but traditionally they haven't covered the cost of running these facilities, so the government has subsidised these facilities, allowed them to run at a loss, and subsidised and made up the deficit that they run at. And we can also see that the voluntary sector inputs into this sector in terms of its time, the time of volunteers to provide sporting opportunities for other people. Okay, so this is the mass participation sports sector, but also money goes out of this sector into the sports equipment sector and the sports clothing and sports shoes sector, which interestingly then, through sponsorship, a lot of these organisations sponsor elite sport. Okay, we've also seen that government taxation takes money out of the sport economy, and we've seen that travel takes money out of the sport economy. So you pay money to Ryanair to fly and support your team in the UEFA Champions League. You pay money to the travel industry to catch the train to watch your football team or to compete in a competition. Okay, so there is a travel industry, and that includes all forms of transport there. Okay, so there are flows out of the economy. So what we're talking about here is flows in and flows out. This is a simplified model. It doesn't show everything. It doesn't show the contribution of education to mass participation. Yeah, it doesn't show that. It doesn't show the at the elite level, it doesn't show the input of sport events to the local economy. It doesn't show the input of events like the London Marathon, which has an elite element to it, but it is also largely a mass participation event, and that generates money into the London and South East regional economy. So it's a simplification, but it does help us see how different organisations input and how money flows into and around the sports economy. Okay, so that is the end of Screencast 2. What I want to talk about in Screencast 3 is another model which is slightly more sophisticated and more recognisable to economists, to try to look at flows of income around and expenditure around the sports economy.